Afternoon and welcome to this Union Co-ops UK webinar session, which is the latest in a series of webinars leading up to our inaugural face-to-face conference at Wortley Hall in South Yorkshire. The conference is called Decent Work and Democracy, and it's taking place on the 20th and 21st of May this year. The booking link for this conference can be found on our website at union-coops.uk. My name is Simon Taylor and I'm a founding member of Union Co-ops UK, and I'm a Unison trade union activist in a large local government branch in the East Midlands. Union Co-ops UK are the lead body advocating for unionised worker cooperative businesses here in the UK, and we are a small organisation of trade unionists, cooperators and academics working to promote fully unionised worker-owned and controlled businesses. We run on a shoestring and would like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who have given us a donation, along with our sponsors, the Bakers Union, the BFAWU, the Musicians Union, and Cooperative Ways Forward, who are sponsoring the bursary scheme for our conference at Wortley Hall. The format for this session is that I will shortly spend a few minutes setting the scene, and then my colleague Alex Bird from Union Co-ops UK will spend some time discussing the Lucas plan and speculate how we believe it may have benefited had Lucas been a worker-owned and operated business. We will then move on to our special guest speaker for this webinar, who is Sarah Woolley from the Bakers Union. Sarah is the General Secretary for the BFAWU and will be sharing with us her union's experience of how workplace democracy works in practice in SUMA, which is a unionised worker co-op with an agreement with the BFAWU. SUMA is a significant wholesaling business providing goods to the whole foods retailing sector nationally and provides to their owner workers a significantly better package of pay, terms and conditions in comparison to their mainstream economic competitors. Following Sarah's presentation, she will form part of a panel discussion prompted by your question and answers. And if you have a question for the panel, can you put it in the chat bar, please, making it clear you are raising a question, and Anita Mangum will moderate them. Finally, Anita will make a few closing comments and we shall finish in time for a light pre-tea time beverage. So without further ado, let's move on to setting the scene. In advance of this presentation, please forgive me for oversimplifying some complex themes in order to make some generalized points. I hope you understand why this is so, as we seek to make the case as to why we are advocating the case for unionised worker-owned and operated businesses under the Union Co-op model. You can find the model discussed in our Union Co-op manifesto available on our website. So when we think about workplaces, in the vast majority of cases, we are considering the standard hierarchical model of organisation, whereby relatively few people at the very top set key priorities, which are then turned into actions by descending layers of management and then workers, with each layer decreasingly unable to exercise influence or control over the process, until we arrive at a shop floor worker who is invariably powerless to do anything more than sell their labour and try to avoid the myriad and often punitive measures used to ensure their labour is productive to the bottom line. Such a process is often demoralising and alienating, even though many workers may be aware of that in those terms. So instead, they focus on concentrating their mental energies on their lives outside of the workplace, finding meaning and agency, sometimes vicariously, in their friends and families, their social lives, hobbies and pastimes, and distractions such as sport and mass entertainment. The irony is that when significant parts of our lives are necessarily given over to the workplace, the lack of agency the vast majority of us are able to exercise in our jobs means that the opportunity to meaningfully enrich ourselves in those jobs is sadly missing. Of course, many people are employed in the public sector and benefit to some degree, at least, from the influence their trade union representatives are able to bring to bear in providing some degree of worker voice. Though I argue that that is an imperfect model and often subject to contradiction and compromise. Imperfect that may be, but at least the unions are in there making the arguments on behalf of their members and the workforce. And those unions often have significant memberships within those employers. The private sector, on the other hand, is in most cases under-unionised, meaning that many workers are not only able to exercise influence and control over their work, but also lack voice in the decision-making processes affecting them. In essence, the concept of democracy in the workplace is alien to those workers and anathema to their employers. Which leads us on to the concept of economic democracy and its interaction with workplace democracy in respect of who benefits from economic activity and its surplus value, and crucially, who decides who benefits. As we know, the standard model of capitalism is rooted in returns to the owners of capital, such as shareholders, rentiers, financial institutions, and the wealthy, followed by excessive remuneration and reward packages for executives, often based on exploiting their position over the interests of their workers and the environment. In those terms, capitalism and its lack of workplace and economic democracy for most is working perfectly and exactly as planned. Historically, there have been a number of responses by workers and ordinary people to the conditions facing them and the lack of voice and agency they experience in their workplaces, not least of which was the rise of trade unionism in industrializing countries. But perhaps with the exception of syndicalist efforts in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which sought to place control of industries in the hands of the workers employed within them, trade unionism has arguably, at least in the UK, been predicated on achieving a compromise between labour and capital so as to achieve better wages, terms and conditions for its members. The notion that those members can control and own their employment has understandably, given the countervailing power wielded by capital and its political allies, been largely unconsidered. Another response via the election of Labour governments was to nationalise whole industries such as coal mining, steel making or shipbuilding in order to bring them into common ownership and under democratic control. Of course, the reality of this in practice was that workers, in theory, had voice in their industries via their trade unions, but in practice, this did not deliver them means to exercise day-to-day control over their employment and working conditions in the manner that true workplace democracy can. It meant that they continued to be subject to hierarchical control, with ownership merely transferred from the owners of capital to the state. And any gains from the flexing of trade union collective power became vulnerable when those industries were returned to capital ownership and trade union power was attacked and diminished by government. Having established that in the vast majority of cases, workers have never been in the situation of owning and controlling their employment, we have to consider where our system of elected political democracy may lie. My personal argument is that as long as there is no mainstream tradition here in the UK for workers owning and exercising control of their employment outside of public services, then their expectation of democracy in the wider sense is conditioned by that lack of control. As such, democracy has become an occasional ballot tick box experience, and one in which the average person has come to believe does not materially and meaningfully improve their day-to-day existence. In the sense that workers are arguably alienated to some degree or other from their employment, they are also arguably alienated in turn to some degree from the very political processes that could materially and meaningfully improve their circumstances. It's a catch-22 situation, and one that for me works consistently well in favour of the interests of capital and their political allies, and equally as consistently against the interests of ordinary people and the environment. So what is the answer to this catch-22 situation? I argue that part of the answer must be for trade unions and others to create the conditions whereby worker ownership and control is far more commonplace than it is today. and that once workers become accustomed to the practice of ownership and control, they will better understand the principles of real democracy. In doing so, promulgate the benefits of such a model more widely in our society, and learn to not only demand a better system of representative democracy, but also to participate far more actively within it. As a starting point, we can take no better a lesson in this than that, considering what happened in the aftermath of the US financial crisis some 12 years or so ago. The United Steelworkers Union, the USW, had concluded that 40 years of sustained attacks upon them and their members by the owners of capital and their political allies had resulted in fewer and fewer gains for their members. And what gains had been made were often lost entirely, along with whole industries, as capital offshored their production to low-wage, low-regulatory countries. In response, the USW took inspiration from what they had learned about worker-owned and operated businesses in the Basque region of Spain, including the social partnership model of worker involvement in the governance structure. And they reasonably argued that if nothing else, workers who owned and operated their own employment were unlikely to offshore their own employment. As a result, the USW understood that as a trade union, they could fill the purpose of the social partnership role in such enterprises, and this led them to co-author the union co-op model that has since served to create worker-owned and operated businesses in the US and inspired the same in other US trade unions. This in turn has been our inspiration here at Union Co-ops UK, and in turn motivated the creation of our Union Co-ops Manifesto, of this series of webinars, and of our in-person conference in May. We suggest that the Union Co-op model is a necessary corrective for our economy, that the model serves to address many of the issues causing alienation from work, that trade union and the cooperative movement should have significant skin in the game in progressing the interests of worker and economic democracy, and that the union co-op model would ultimately contribute to a healthier democracy for all. I'm going to hand over in a moment to my colleague Alex Bird to talk about the Lucas plan. I hope many of you are familiar with this, but before that I'd like to say something briefly about our special guest speaker, Sarah Woolley. We're privileged to have the General Secretary of a union here in the UK that has a very active involvement with SUMA as a significant unionised worker-owned and operated business. Both Sarah and a union's president are on the record as saying they wish there were more SUMAs. They can see implicitly how the union fits into its role representing the interests of their members in such an organisation, how its members benefit from that, how the business benefits, how true worker voice and agency can be preserved and enhanced as a result, and how the Bakers Union benefits in turn from its active involvement. Thank you, and it's over to yourself now, Alex.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'd just like to introduce the idea, of course, that I'm not just a member of Union Co-ops UK, but I'm also a long-term cooperator, having worked in worker co-ops over many, many years. I'm going to give you what is now very much an engineer's view of what's actually happened in the worker co-op movement, because I've always been an engineer myself, and therefore I come with that sort of engineer's view of the world. So when I've looked at the Lucas plan, I've looked at it in terms of the things it made and the things it did, rather than all of the politics that lay behind it. You can see here on the slide the book by Hilary Wainwright and Dave Elliott. If you want to know the details of the plan, this is the book I recommend. My copy is rather aging and the pages have fallen out because it's one of the originals, but it is now available in a new edition. So just to run you through here, I'm sorry about that. Lucas Aerospace employed 13,000 people at 17 factories, mostly in the West Midlands. And in 1974, following a period of expansion, Lucas, along with other aerospace companies, announced a need to restructure because they could see that the market they were operating in was decreasing, and there was increased international competition, etc. So what was clear to the Combine Committee, that is the combined committee for all of the various union reps working across those 17 factories, they could see that we're going to be mass redundancies coming. So they came up with the idea of an alternative corporate plan, and it came as a result of going to meet the Minister for Industry in November 1974, which was, of course, Tony Benn. 34 of the combined delegates went to see Tony up, I believe, in the House of Commons, in an attempt to persuade him that they needed to include Lucas Aerospace in the nationalisation of the aerospace industry. And it was back in a day when nationalisation was not a dirty word. It was the normal way that you ran really important things, so that electricity, gas, telecoms, etc., were all nationalised at the time, and there was no sign of them being unnationalised. Now, Tony Benn indicated he didn't have the power to include Lucas Aerospace in the nationalisation programme, and he suggested that the Combine come up with an alternative corporate strategy for the company, leaving the company as an independent company, but bringing some changes. So they spent a couple of years working on the plan. In 1976, they put their plan forward to the management. They proposed to increase worker democracy. They felt that was really important to them, so that they can actually have some input into the company, because they felt very much powerless, very much just cogs in the wheel, with management making all of the decisions. And like most engineers, there are people always think of engineers as not being particularly creative. They think artists and writers and filmmakers and so on are creative, but actually engineers are themselves very creative, designing and making new machinery, working from new ideas and trying to develop those and see them being put. So most engineers are actually interested in doing something socially useful, and they felt that they were trapped. They were using their skills in the arms industry, which is not what they really wanted to do. And I feel very much in sympathy with them, because I spent the years up until 1976 working in the power industry, and I'm working, including in the power industry in coal stations, but also I spent 5 years in nuclear power stations, and met lots of people there, engineers and physicists, health physicists, etc., who were very strongly committed to doing something socially useful. And some of them that I worked with had left the arms industry specifically to come and work in the civil plan. So 1977, the Joint Shop Stewards didn't just propose their plan to the management, but they decided that they would publish it. Here's the members of the Lucas Aerospace Combine Committee on the steps at Wortley Hall. Wortley Hall, of course, is the place where we will be holding our conference on the 20th and 21st of May. An interesting bunch, all, of course, white males, as you would expect. That was the nature of that sort of employment at the time. It's not that the trade union movement was particularly discriminatory. It's just that everyone in that level, and these were mostly the engineers, these were drawing office people and design engineers, mostly that really got interested in this. So what was the Lucas plan like? Well, of course, it's 1976. It's a corporate plan. It's been typed up lovingly, 53 pages of it on A4 paper with a manual typewriter. Not the way that we would do it now. Anyway, how was the plan received? The Lucas management rejected it out of hand, lampooning wind and solar power as being, and this is a direct quote from, in the realm of the brown bread and sandals brigade. Harold Wilson sided with the company. Tony Benn had already been quietly moved on into as I recall it, into the post office. The Combine's alternative corporate plan received support from around the world, Sweden, Germany, Australia, and the USA in particular. And Mike Cooley, who was a leading member of the Combine, received the Right Livelihood Award. And the money from that he donated to the Combine. 1984, the TGWU, which was under Ron Todd, enthusiastically took up the ideas and produced a similar strategy of their own. So the products that they developed were completely unrealistic, obviously, or so the management said. So they produced this little thing. It's a hybrid car. It's based on a Reliant Robin engine, fiberglass body, great big batteries. It's an 850cc, 40 horsepower engine, but it's also got a 20 kilowatt generator that drives a 50 kilowatt electric drive motor. This car, this prototype was registered for the road. It's not been scrapped. I checked its MOT. The owner is unknown. You can't get that information anywhere. It's not been MOT'd since 2008, but it does still exist somewhere. The other one they produced was an all-electric car, and they were working there with the Polytechnic at Coventry. Between them and the Combine Committee, they developed this Unit for Development of Alternative Products, UDAP, and worked with the students there. They built an actual electric car, which was road tested and registered to be driven. And you could see from its number plate that that also was registered for the road and drove around Coventry with the Polytechnic emblem on it. They also produced a bus, but it's a road rail bus. So they took an ordinary bus with its its tires, etc., so it can drive on the road, and they added rail undergear, so you could drive this thing up to the end of a railway line, and then take it in a spin in the perfectly normal way that any other train would go. And here's a picture of it at the platform on its demonstration runs. What else did they do? They developed designs for a wind turbine, a heat pump to run domestic central heating using natural gas running in a small internal combustion engine. So it would be a gas-powered heat pump, unlike the heat pumps we have now, which are electric. They produced a lightweight iron lung made of fiberglass. And they produced a simplified bath lift aid for people with disabilities. So simple, practical, useful things, clearly well ahead of their time. Lucas Aerospace Management said no, and they turned them all down, even the ones that were demonstrable as prototypes. So if there'd been a union co-op, how would it have been different? If the workers had actually owned the company and been able to direct it, well, the Combine Committee would probably have been the board of directors. And the workers would probably have put into production what the management thought would never catch on. So you would have had Lucas hybrid cars in production 15 years before the first Prius. You would have had Lucas all-electric cars in production 30 years before the first Tesla came along in 2008. We would have Lucas road rail buses driving around the country, able to go off from the end of the rails into remote country areas and off at the other end and driving around city centres. So you would have a complete integrated road rail system where people didn't have to get out of their seats. They'd hop on a bus and it would take them long distances into town on the rails and then deliver them almost to their door. Lucas wind turbines would be made in the UK. We've had attempts to manufacture wind turbines in the UK. Currently, there are no factories producing wind turbines. And we'd have had Lucas gas-powered heat pumps for central heating 40 years ahead of their time. Instead, Lucas management took the easy option, and they took, which they'd had before, a time and materials contract with the Ministry of Defence, which ensured they'd never make a loss. They just put in an hourly rate, and they simply charged all the time for time and materials, which is, as we often criticize now still with so many bits of privatization, that the risk is socialized and the profit is privatized. And that's the contract they had. And they thought they were onto a cushy little number. But August 1996, they were taken over by the North American Verity Corporation. So there we have it. That was what happened, what might have happened, and sadly didn't. So with that, I'll hand back to Sarah now, who's going to talk to us about the activities that she's engaged in. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you for such a warm introduction earlier, Simon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a privilege to be able to join you this afternoon and talk a little bit about why the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union supports worker co-ops, why it's important that the trade union movement and the cooperative movement work together, and the benefits of having unionised members in a worker cooperative. And Simon's right, I definitely think there should be more SUMAs in the food industry and equivalents in other sectors of our economy. And I'm going to concentrate mainly on SUMA this afternoon, but we'll touch on a couple of other smaller worker cooperatives that we've members in other areas of the country. So for those of you that don't know, the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union represents workers throughout the food industry across all levels of production, delivery and retail. And we have had a long-term informal gentleman's agreement, if you like, recognition agreement with SUMA Whole Foods, a worker cooperative, as Simon said, based in Halifax in Yorkshire. And that's expanded in recent years and now as a distribution hub in London also, which shows how successful the cooperative is doing. And we've had this informal verbal recognition agreement for well over 20 years. It's probably nearer to 30 now. But over the last couple of years, it's probably nearer to 30, but thanks to the hard work and determination of the branch officials who are members of the co-op over the last couple of years, we've finally managed to get a formal written agreement down on paper. It's taken a little bit longer than I think the reps would have liked, mainly due to the pandemic and the hiccups of that. And it doesn't look like one of our traditional agreements, but by its very structure based on democracy, SUMA isn't like one of the traditional workplaces that we have got members in, which are very much like the organisations Simon outlined in his introduction, led by CEOs and shareholders who make decisions. Workers are then left to work with under the structure of management. It's a fantastic achievement that we've got to this point, and it's going to ensure that members of the union and the co-op can work together going forwards in the future with a clear understanding of each other's roles. It removes some of the threats that might have been faced by certain individuals or felt by certain individuals, certainly newer individuals within the cooperative. But more importantly, there's no grey areas. So when somebody leaves, there's no, well, what actually was agreed, or I don't remember that, which it's a fantastic opportunity for us. And I believe that the branch are now at the point where the agreement is working its way through the democratic processes of the cooperative. But I have seen that Freddie, the branch secretary, is on the call, and he might be able to give a more up-to-date picture of where we are now than I can when we go into the Q&As at the end. From a personal perspective, and I've said this before, I've learned so much from working with the reps at SUMA about how a worker cooperative works. My background is working for Greggs, which is a very different structure. And I'll admit, before becoming an official in the union, embarrassingly, or maybe it's a realistic picture of the general public's understanding, as I probably won't be the only person outside of the movement, my only real knowledge of a co-op, if you like, was that it was the name of my local supermarket. And I think that's something that we've got to look at as a joint movement going forwards. But I really think that all unions should be looking to work closer together with cooperatives, as after all, our structures are so aligned, from membership and how that works to the decision-making being held at conferences or AGMs on behalf of the organisation, and everything and anything in between. And comparing to SUMA with other sites that I've looked at after as an official, there's such a different atmosphere. An organisation where everyone is treated equally. Jobs and roles are shared out and rotated, whilst recognising and utilising people's skill sets, makes in general a workforce that feels appreciated and recognised for the work that they do. Now, that isn't to say that it isn't without its problems, and there are times when frustrations occur, especially when things are changing. And I know SUMA's gone through a lot of change over the last few years, as people have moved on, new people with different ideas of how a worker co-op should be run have come in, and dealing with the ripples that has caused has been challenging at times. But as a group of members, they are by far our highest paid. And the fact that they've got the power to collectively to decide what to do with the profits of the business, how much to invest back into it to improve it, how much to share between them, puts them a world apart from other members who are beholden to shareholders and CEOs removing profits and pushing down terms and conditions, especially after the last couple of years. And I remember, and apologies if you've heard this story before, but I remember visiting the site for the first time and walking into the canteen, which isn't like a canteen at all. I mean, there's no till for a start. And that's because SUMA members decided together, collectively, democratically, that providing 3 meals a day for workers and really lucky visitors like me, because the food's delicious, is the right thing to do. And I don't think, other than maybe a burger at McDonald's whilst on shift, or bread for toast at Warburton's, or maybe through the pandemic as a thank you, we have any other site where we've got members in that provides 3 proper warm meals for workers every day for free, prepared, cooked from fresh, and then cleaned up by the workers themselves. And that shows a real difference between workers that stand together, make decisions together and empower each other, and workers that are left to look after themselves because the bosses have decided profits are more important. One of our newer branches is a small pub in London, the Ivy House, that was founded in its current form in 2013 after the building was saved by residents and locals from it being demolished. I still don't know too much about the pub itself. With COVID and me being in Yorkshire and it being based in London, I've not really been down to see it, although it is definitely on my plans to do so. But I know that Frank and Steve, before we retired, the officials from the region, like me with SUMA, have learned from the branch how different things can be for workers when they're part of that decision-making process and not just subjected to changes by people not affected directly by them. And we're also talking to a few community-based cafes in Sheffield around working towards some sort of union recognition within them too. And we'll continue to build on our cooperative branches, offering our support and knowledge around trade unions, employment law, representation, education, because that's what trade unions do. But we'll also continue to learn from the worker cooperatives that we meet, developing the model as we progress through, because as I mentioned earlier, myself and the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union believes that worker co-ops offer a fantastic opportunity for workers to retain the skills that they've had and utilise them in a workplace structure that is better paid, that's more secure, where workers are fully engaged in the decision-making process, and who receive a fair share of the profits off the back of their hard work. You know, and after the last 2 years with the pandemic and our members being called key workers, you know, what better position to be in than that? We've so much to learn from each other as the two movements, but also to offer each other. As I mentioned, you know, our knowledge around employment law and education, but equally the union co-ops and the structures and how to form them. And we're proud as a union to be supporting the work that union co-ops do and the fantastic work that they're doing to offer an alternative to workers, not just in our industry, not just in the food industry, you know, and your musicians and care workers and education sectors are all looking at worker cooperatives too. But they're also changing communities as well as a result of the work that they're doing, which is amazing. We know that going forwards, the food industry is changing. It's going to be more greener, it's going to be more automated, and that's going to be fast forwarded by the pandemic because employers want machines that don't go off ill when there's a virus raging around the world. And we know that will then mean there are opportunities for our members to move out of the workplaces where they are currently in. And I say opportunities because in reality, the word was redundancies. And that's so very negative and puts a chain around people's necks. But it is an opportunity. It would be great for us to be able to support them in opening up their own worker cooperatives so that we don't lose their skills from the industry, but keep them within it. but we reshape the industry, the food industry, and our communities for the better of the workers rather than the private businesses that currently dominate it. And that'll also improve the communities that they're within, because if they're earning more money and they're sharing in the profits, they'll spend more in their local communities, which will benefit that as well. But we know that that's going to take time. The pressure and the stress of being told that you've no longer got a job scares people, and it's going to take a lot of work to empower workers that would, under normal circumstances, just take their redundancy payment, retire early, or move out of the industry and try something new. That route isn't the only option, that they can create their own business by clubbing together, and that it can work. You only have to look at the community supporting the Ivy House to see that that is an option, and it's a viable option for people. Now, I know that that's a very simplistic view of things, and the reality is it will be hard work. They will need lots of support, some that we as a trade union wouldn't be able to give, but the cooperative movement could. But just imagine, wouldn't it be fantastic to see those workers continue in our industry, using the skills and knowledge that they've built up for years to make a business in, which they are the driving force, and reap the rewards for their work. And I think when I talk about this, I think about one of the first sites that I was involved with that took strike action when I first became an official, that shut at the beginning of the pandemic. Those workers could have clubbed together and kept that site going, possibly not in its current form, but wouldn't that been amazing? Rather than a billionaire reaping the profits, you know, decimating the site and destroying terms and conditions of workers, they could have clubbed together, been more ethical in the way that they operate, and be more profitable as a result as well. Now, obviously, the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union aren't experts in setting up worker cooperatives, but I know that working with union-coops UK and all the knowledge and experience that is held within that team, that are fantastic, by the way, and the webinar series that they've put on and the conference that we're going to all be attending in person is going to be brilliant. It will be brilliant for the cooperative movement and the trade union movement. But I know working together that we can change the narrative and offer a different future to workers together. Thank you again for the invitation to speak. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We're moving on to the Q&A now, but before we do, could I just say thanks so much for your enthusiasm and your support for us all. You really do keep us going when we think, oh, what do we do next? So for the next part, we're going to have an open Q&A with the panel members of Sarah, Alex Bird and Scilla Ross. We have a few questions already in the panel. I'm going to read them out in turn. So if you do have a question, please do get typing. We'll start off though with one from Simon Taylor, which is, at this point, does the focus need to be on raising awareness of workplace democracy among officers and activists, or among the wider membership? So raising awareness of workplace democracy. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to go first, and we'll take it around the panel in turns?
I think the simple answer is yes. People just are so ingrained in the way that things are. You know, I wouldn't have even dreamt of working in a worker co-op when I was doing Greggs, because I didn't really know what they were and what it entailed. But if we can raise awareness that another world is possible, if you like, and that worker co-ops are successful and they are something that people can do, then yeah, I think there'd be more support for them. There'd be more people willing to kind of put their head above the parapet and try it out. So yeah, I think we need to do that, because people are just, you know, under the thumb, if you like. My boss tells me what to do, and that's the only option that I've got, and there's so many more.
Alex and Scilla, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I like to just, I totally agree with Sarah, and it's a great question. And I suppose without being over nostalgic, it just reminds me of what a loss union political education is to these sort of questions. Because, you know, nobody's suggesting that you know, all the political education in trade unions was always, you know, at the cutting edge of stuff, but it was often space to have these sorts of conversations and to raise alternatives. And just, you know, reflecting on what Sarah said, I'm just wondering if one of the ways forward is to sort of reconnect with where there is, you know, sort of trade union education agendas within unions, and to you know, try and encourage them to think again about how we need to look at this type of agenda. And I think, Sarah, you're absolutely right, you know, framing it as within the context of the unknowable future of work. You know, it's not about trying to terrify people, it's just where we are and where we're going, and everybody knows that. So it's been very pragmatic and practical, and perhaps less of the sort of, you know, open-toed sandals and brown rice that Alex talked about when the Lucas plan was first mooted. But you know, I do think that's something that we should consider doing as possible next steps as organisationally.
I think it's
Alex,
really
would you
important.
like to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we do work with the, you know, the activists and officials within the trade union movement. They're not the only people that we need to deal with, but they are, as we must remember, for many workers, the shop steward and the branch secretary and so on are really key, important advisors for them in their lives, and will often provide advice outside normal union business as well. Like, you know, what do I do with my credit cards maxed out? And they often are almost mentors for people. So I think for those who are already in a workplace, in a trade union, it's really important that we get to those key influences and sort of shapers of people. But I also think we mustn't forget, and that is particularly important when we see conversions, when we see commercial businesses that have the possibility of turning into union co-ops. And if you look in the manifesto, there are some magnificently large examples, most of them in Europe and in the States. But also for startups, we also need to get out and influence the professionals, the bank managers and the accountants and the formal government, government paid for business advisors. So we've got to work on both, but here and now, I think our top priority is to work with the union activists and organisers.
Great, thanks, Alex. The next question is from Scylla herself, who asks Sarah, in Sarah's view, how should we approach trade unions to introduce the idea of the union co-op as a robust alternative for a different future of work and workplace democracy? So any ideas about next steps?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So there's we passed a motion at the General Federation of Trade Unions biennial conference, and I wanted to get that right rather than using acronyms then, apologies, last year around supporting the work of union-coops UK. So you've already got an in there with all the affiliates, and I can get you that information over to you. When they held a joint meeting with CWU around community organisations, I introduced Simon to the Deputy General Secretary of CWU, and I will follow that up, Simon, because I know that it's kind of fizzled out a little bit. But I think just events like this and getting it out there, being on social media, talking to the members and the activists are really important, because they are the people that run the union. It's not me as a general secretary, it's our members and our branches. So, you know, having Freddie on from SUMA is fantastic, because he can then feed into, you know, our regional council, our national conference about the cooperative and the importance of being involved. And I think that's where we need to pitch it at, raising that awareness and going in at the members. Yes, we need to talk to the people at the top just for bureaucratic sake, but it's the members that drive the policy in the union through their conferences.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. There are loads of really terrific comments going on in the sidebar in the chat, and a couple of questions coming in as well. But I wonder, there's a terrific reflection from Bob Cannell about how the bakers and SUMA got together. Bob, I wonder, would you mind saying a few words rather than just hiding out in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very aware that everything I say about SUMA is historical. I've been retired 6 years now. Yeah, well, the problem we had, we wanted to be unionised when SUMA was in Leeds, and the most obvious one, of course, was the Transport and General Workers Union, since we saw ourselves as a distribution business. But they wouldn't have us because they said that we were management, and so the transport branch in Leeds refused to have us, and we got dumped in a completely inappropriate branch, which was hopeless. And the TNG really, it was so unfriendly. So when SUMA moved to Halifax, we cast around looking for another union that would be more sympathetic, and it was necessary because some of us, including me, were Labour Party officials at the time, and you had to be a union member if you were a Labour Party official in those days. You had to show your union cards before you were allowed to stand for election. So we asked Usdaw, and we asked the Bakers, and we asked a couple of others, and the Bakers were amazing. I mean, they were on the doorstep the next morning. Right? We want to talk to you. And from that day on, it's always been, and still is, as far as I can tell, a very active relationship. And people say, so how does that work in a worker co-op? Well, in the mid-90s, I took over the personnel role, officer role. Most places it would be personnel manager, but at SUMA it was called an officer because it was a coordinating role rather than a management hierarchy role. And the Bakers local officer and national officers would just help us with all sorts of things, because none of us were traditional business people. We were finding our own way through employment law and health and safety law and all sorts of other things. And the Bakers union officers would say, well, this is how they do it at other places. This is the sort of things you need to be doing. And I'd be going, well, we can't do that here because, we're a worker co-op and people don't like being ordered around, and they just refuse to do it if you order them. It has to be done a different way. And so we found ways of making that work in a worker co-op very well indeed. I mean, I'll just give you one example. In a worker co-op, it is right, is it not, that the workers have the democratic right to choose who they work alongside. But employment law says a democratic vote of a workers' co-op, it doesn't count in terms of ending employment. It's unfair dismissal. So we had to find a way of balancing those two things: people's rights as individuals to their employment rights and the collective right of worker co-op members to say, we don't want to work with that person. And that did happen occasionally, and we managed to sort it out. We managed to sort it out every time. And then when somebody did need representing, when somebody was in trouble or there was something official happening, then the union officer would come in, and we'd move to different sides of the table, and then it would be almost like a normal negotiating session. The union officer would remind SUMA, through me, of SUMA's rights and responsibilities in this situation, and I would remind SUMA members that they couldn't just take decisions unless they were wanting to pay a lot of money and have much less Christmas bonus as a result, which usually meant that they'd say, okay, how can we do this the civilized way? And it was always sorted out in that way, right up until I left. And I was very impressed. Because one of the great things about the Bakers is it's a small union, there's so much less bureaucracy. One of the problems with the TNG was we couldn't talk to anybody who had any influence, because we were just shut out like most other branch members. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Just going down through the chat, there's been some comments about the importance of awareness raising. So Colin Massey remarking that it's also linked to community wealth building practices. Niall Mulholland saying that the discussion, it's an important discussion. What sort of workplace can we have, run by whom, utilising workers' initiatives, etc. That's sadly lacking in most union structure these days. And on to the next question from John Goodman, which is that I recall trade union-led worker co-ops in the 70s being pretty unsuccessful. For example, the Taunton Unicorn Shirts and the Ben co-ops. Many reasons have been put forward for this over the years, but I wonder if there's a fundamental strategic difference between introducing unions in failing businesses to the
the detail and depth in Freddie's report from SUMA about all the work that they're doing, which is raising awareness to other branches around the different issues that worker cooperatives are having. And if we can do that with a group of reps that aren't all, working in worker co-ops, then there's absolutely no reason why we can't do that further afield. And there's other organisations like National Shop Stewards Network that does something similar. It networks shop stewards nationally. It does what it says in the tin. I mean, it's a different kettle of fish, but I don't see there's any reason why we couldn't utilise a model where we get shop stewards together in the first instance. Then you kind of like in the middle, aren't you, of the membership awareness and the bureaucratic people at the top, you're getting the people at the face of the union in the workplace involved.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that one?
No, I think Sarah, yeah, that was a good point. Don't need to answer anymore.
Okay, thanks. We'll move on to Niall's question and then on to Leslie. So Niall's question is, what do panelists think of secondary co-ops? So My Housing Co-op and others locally in East London are considering bringing housing repairs and maintenance and admin, etc., all back in-house by setting up a workers' co-op that could service our housing co-ops, which aren't worker co-ops as such, but are member-led, democratically run tenants' housing co-ops. So secondary co-ops.
I was going to propose that Alex might like to say something about that, being a very seasoned cooperator. So I'd pass over to him.
Well, I would say that's not actually a secondary co-op. Secondary co-ops are co-ops of, depending on where you sit in history and which version you go for, they're either co-ops of co-ops or co-ops of small businesses. And I tend to think of them as both. So instead of being a co-op of individual humans engaged in an activity either as consumers or workers, they are co-ops of other sorts of small businesses. So agricultural co-ops is probably the commonest of all, where farm businesses could be a co-op conceivably, or mostly they're little family businesses and partnerships that are then part of a co-op and participate as a business within that co-op. The situation just being described is of two co-ops, what is essentially a multi-stakeholder as a housing co-op. They would usually involve the funders and partners that they may work with who are feeding people into the co-op, together with the tenants. That would be a co-op, and then this would be a partner co-op sitting and working with them as a separate entity, as a worker co-op. So great relationship, something I would very much encourage, but I don't think technically it fits the definition of a secondary co-op. So definitely something to be enthusiastic about and to work for. And I'm sure that the workforce will feel much better off, as we've heard the descriptions in SUMA of how workers come together when they've got the empowerment that brings them more efficiency, and they're not getting the 10% or more sliced off the top into some rich person's pocket.
Great, thanks, Alex. We're moving on to Leslie now, who has patiently had his hand raised for a long time. So Leslie, over to you. Sorry, Leslie, you're on mute.
I'm being very disciplined. In fact, I've just put my hand down. Can I say, first of all, this is a very interesting discussion, particularly for those of us like Alex and John and Bob, and those of us who've been doing this, I suppose, since the 1970s. I think the big thing that we don't any longer have is the infrastructure that we had previously. When we occupied Meriden, for example, in 1973, and even when we tried to get the Taunton Shirt Co-op in 1981, we had some infrastructure. We had local authorities with a lot of co-op development agencies. We'd had the 1976 Industrial Common Ownership Act. We'd had the 1978 Cooperative Development Agency Act. And all of those performed a very useful infrastructure function. We don't have any of that now. Any of the share ownership stuff that John and Jeremy were proposing in 2017 and 2019, I don't think, quite honestly, we will get that anymore under Starmer Labour. So even some of the prospects that we've had fairly recently for restoring some of the formulae for alternative models of ownership, we really are going to have to look around very, very seriously to find out where that's coming from. First of all, by the way, I wish we'd got a few more general secretaries like Sarah. And I wish we'd got a few more trade unions taking the same position on co-ops that the bakers have. But it's unfortunately the case that very few unions nationally have positions on co-ops. The position of the Labour Party, I can't see the Labour Party, for example, putting together John McDonnell's implementation group that we had in 2018 and 2019. So we've got to find ways of doing it. I would like to think that union co-ops is a very good platform and a very good way forward. I would like to think that Sarah can get a few other union general secretaries putting resolutions at their annual conferences and things like that. But I think that we're going to have to do what we tried to do in the 1970s and 1980s in very much the grassroots way that the Lucas Aerospace Combine shop stewards did it. And it wasn't, by the way, just Lucas. We had similar combines in Vickers. We had similar combines in Chrysler. We had similar combines, of course, obviously in British Leyland, with which I was very much associated. So in those days, the way that we put forward the argument wasn't, if I may say so, from the hierarchy of the trade union movement. It came from much further down and essentially from shop stewards' combines. So I think what we have to try and do is to try and find a way very much at that grassroots level of replicating that. I wish we were going to get a bit more of that from the trade union leadership. As I say, I wish we got a few more general secretaries like Sarah and a few more trade unions nationally taking the position that the bakers do. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So if this is going to be moved forward in future, it's going to have to be grassroots. It's going to have to be from the bottom up. And it's going to have to be, if I may say so, back to the shop stewards and lay members combines that we had in the 1970s and 1980s.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Leslie. There's an awful lot to unpack there in all of Leslie's suggestions, but particularly about the power of grassroots activism and shop steward activism. So over to you, panel. Scilla, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, really valuable points, Leslie, and, you know, spot on. But I think we've also got a job to do working with what I define of as cooperative activists. You know, it's also, we need to focus on the grassroots. We need to have member-driven solutions, whether that be within trade unions or cooperatives. And I think perhaps one of the missing pieces of the jigsaw for me, I'm not negating anything you've said, and I know how challenging it is you know, to work with grassroots activists within unions when there are so many other issues they're dealing with, from precarity to you name it. But the point is, we also need to have a sustained effort, I think, of how we actually talk to activist cooperators as well, and how they can force that demand for organising through and thinking about different ways of working with trade unions. So somehow or other, for me, it's bringing those two together and making that a joint focus. And that's one of the things we try and do here, but other people will have lots of other ideas as well. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
Alex or Sarah, would you like to? Alex?
Yeah, I think the rebuilding, the recreation of grassroots activism is really, really important. And it was very, very powerful. I mean, I worked in the power industry and the electricity generating industry for quite a few years. And there, the Joint Shop Stewards Committees had an immense amount of power and immense amount of organization. So it's rebuilding that grassroots organization, but also, of course, as we've said before, educating that grassroots organization so that it recognizes that co-ops is a really good way of getting some power back in the workplace for the ordinary working people.
I have nothing to add other than to agree with what Scilla and Alex have both said.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Well, next with his hand raised, we have Freddie from SUMA. So Freddie, over to you. Thanks.
Hello, I've been trying to raise my hand for ages, but it's not working in my screen. It's very good to have Bob Canal with us. He was one of the founders of the Bakers Union at SUMA. And as we say before, the union is still running, probably in a very different context. It's very important to have this discussion about the grassroots and how to reach more workers with this idea of working cooperatives and unions. We also have to recognize that the model as it has been proposed in this forum since from the beginning is designed for a work where co-ops, for other co-ops, not like SUMA. You know, we are a completely flat structure. Every worker has a vote in our main decisions. We have equal pay that many others don't have. We don't have bosses. We don't have managers that many other places have. So somehow this model is very interesting, but probably not completely fit for purpose in our particular case. However, I think it's very important to try to push the idea for, you know, to promote how into other workers about how to be autonomous, you know, to reclaim workers' power. Very difficult. Well, it's not all the times possible to do it via cooperatives, but there are other ways of empowering workers. And even if we don't convert every cooperative in the UK into a unionized cooperative, we can try to help and improve workers' lives. We probably will have time in the conference to talk more about the particular experience of SUMA. It will be interesting to share it with you. We probably became, as we are the biggest cooperative in the UK, we are too satisfied with who we are, and probably we need to be more engaged with the movement outside our comfort zone. That's what I wanted to say.
Great, thank you so much, Freddie. Would anybody like to comment on that or add to what Freddie has been saying? Okay, nothing from Scilla, Alex or Sarah? No, okay, great. Just checking, see where I am on the questions. Actually, Sarah was talking about the role of community and community wealth building and consciousness raising and awareness raising has been coming up in the chat. So there's a comment here from Colin Massey. One other type of union is that is grassroots led and currently doing lots of popular education are community unions in Oxford, I believe Acorn are supporting the creation of co-ops. So I don't know if that's anything that the panel have experience of, or that they might like to talk about. Certainly, I am very interested in what Sarah was saying about community benefits and union members being members of the wider community.
Does that mean I get to go first then?
Well, if you'd like.
I don't know enough about the work that Acorn are doing to talk about it in any great detail. I do know that I came across last year an organisation called Community Towns, and they're helping communities set up their own kind of food co-op. But it's not really a worker co-op, it's more a food co-op, you know, 20 households dip in. But I think that will help people realise that if we can do it for a food cooperative, we can do it for a workplace. So for me, it's a natural next step. But in terms of like community work, we've been doing some stuff in Wigan around getting community engagement, what a trade union is, what are the political issues, you know, what are the social issues that are there. And I think just you only have to look at places like Sheffield, and I'm bouncing about a bit here because I've not really got an answer, but you only have to look at places like Sheffield with the community cafes that are worker co-ops and how successful they've been and how many of them have popped up, to see that people do want change. It's just being empowered to be able to do it. And if they can do it in Sheffield, they can do it in any town and city. And that alone is then, you know, making more people aware of what a cooperative is, and not just the supermarket that I mentioned earlier. I think I waffled a little bit then. Sorry, Anita.
Thanks, Sarah. And I was just going to, I mean, I don't know anything about the work that Acorn is doing, although I have heard of them. But I just wanted to draw attention to some of the good practice, and it's not universal, but there is some good practice that's coming out of some of the cooperative councils that are affiliated to the Cooperative Council Innovation Network. Now, it's uneven, as you might expect, but I can speak about Rochdale, which obviously, you know, has home of cooperation. You'd hope they'd be doing something. But they are actually, for example, looking at how cooperatives can build local community wealth, as Colin referenced there in his comment in the chat. And they're doing it through the creation of culture co-ops and young people's co-ops. But the good thing about they're looking at in Rochdale is they are very mindful of the need to be union organised. That's not right across the piece, but there are people in there who recognise that that is an important part of what they're doing. And I just think, finally, on that point, when, you know, you made the point, Colin, that, you know, that there is community. I mean, trade union education stroke, the sort of cooperative education that we always talk about, is so closely aligned to community education, isn't it? Because it's, you know, that's grassroots learning about how to do this thing called cooperatives. And I think, you know, it's as I say, it's slightly unbalanced, or I would suggest, across the country. But there are some examples of good practice, and I think unions and local communities have to support councils when they are genuinely trying to do it authentically. And I think, you know, we know about places like Preston, but there are other councils as well. So, you know, that's worth looking out for as well.
Brilliant, thanks,
here,
Alex. Yeah.
Here in South Wales, I'm not active within it, but I have colleagues and friends who are. Acorn is very much concentrating on the struggle against private landlords, which is particularly in Cardiff, where I live, is a really big issue because we have so many students and so much student accommodation. So I'm very pleased to hear that they're trying to get involved in and interested in looking at co-ops. The other thing that's quite active where I am is Unite Community, which tries to engage in various campaigns and struggles. And of course, with a new General Secretary, Sharon Graham, who's now looking very much not towards the Labour Party to be the salvation of everything, and he's getting back to old-fashioned union struggles. As far as I'm aware, she has no knowledge of or interest in, particularly in co-ops, but I think I'm sure she can be persuaded if we can actually get to meet and speak to her. So there's that attitude of you've just got to get on and do it, JFDI, and there are polite versions as well as rude versions of JFDI. I also think, and it goes back to the point that Leslie was making about the structures that we had in the 70s, you know, the infrastructure support through all of the local CDAs and co-op development organizations, and that getting that back in place, getting the legalities and governance advice back in place is really, really important. And I worry about some of the small worker co-ops that are being set up, whether they're actually getting the legal ownership and governance right. And I'm reminded of Oz magazine, not usually an example I put forwards, but those of us who are old enough to remember it, Oz magazine was very much run as a collective. Everyone thought it was a joint struggle. And it was only when the legal cases started over the school grids issue that they discovered the actual legal structure of it was a private limited company with one shareholder, and that was Felix Dennis, who owned it all. So it's very important that people do get the real underlying legal advice to get their underlying structures correct. So that we've got to try and build on that wealth of knowledge. And I think, again, for us in the union co-ops movement, if we can educate people within the trade union movement, we've got an immense network there that already is there and still does exist. The CDAs may be quite thin on the ground, but trade unions are still large and powerful.
Great, thank you, Alex. We have time for one last question, which is from Martin Metiard for Sarah. Sarah, could you explain a bit, if you know, about the GFTU and how it is related to the TUC and STUC? The newest General Secretary of STUC, Ros Foyer, is very well disposed to co-ops.
So my understanding is that when the GFTU was formed, the General Federation of Trade Unions, it was more designed to be a educational arm slash a place where workers in struggle could go to for financial support and grants. It's kind of manifested itself over the years. Please excuse the background noise. My partner's now emptying the dishwasher. I don't know if you can hear it, but I can hear it very loud. And now they're very separate. Basically, they're very separate. The TUC is a body, an umbrella body with, I think it's got 54 trade unions affiliated to it. The GFTU is a very smaller version. It's got 26 trade unions, predominantly specialist ones. So like suppose the Prison Officers Association, the Professional Footballers, the Artists Union of England. There are some elements of PCS and GMB, but they're because the GMB section is because another union's gone into it historically. But they're very much separate entities now. They will work together as and when needed, but the GFTU is education focused and campaigning and international things, and the TUC is a whole body with an international element to it as well. And the STUC is an arm of that, just as like the Welsh TUC is, and the Northern Ireland version as well. I don't know Ros well. I think she started around the same time as I did with COVID coming in. I've had a brief meeting with her when we were both at an event together, but nothing concrete to have a proper discussion with her. But I hope that helps explain it a little bit. There's a lot of information on the GFTU's website and a lot of historical information on there that if you wanted to have a look more into it. But yeah, they're very much separate entities.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. It's more or less time to wrap up now, but before I say some final words, do the panel want to add anything else to the discussion?
No, not really, except just briefly to say that I think, you know, there's something here, isn't there, about drawing on what's been and using the best examples of that to applying to the challenges and questions we've got now. But I think there's something really important that Bob Cannell put in I mean, there's lots of great comments in chat, Anita, as you pointed out. but I do think we are seeing some movement towards young people moving towards a different model of work. Now, that might be less about, you know, there's lots of different reasons for that, and all the research tells us that, doesn't it? You know, some people feel they're forced into it, others are actually choosing to do it because they want to work in different ways. And it just seems to me more imperative than ever that we make sure that we have that information out there for people who do want to set up alternative structures. And my slight concern is, and this isn't having a go at anybody, is that it's not immediately there. You know, it seems to me that if I was a young person thinking about a different model of work or setting something up, you know, who would I actually go to? You know, I know there's the apex body and so on, but it's that, so something we've lost, haven't we, is that sort of folk knowledge about different models and alternative models in both the co-op union movements. So how do we get that back so that it's exciting and inspiring, you know, and really makes people think that it's something worth exploring? So it's great to have these sort of discussions, because I think we'll stumble towards something eventually. So thanks.
Scilla, as usual, you do a much better job than any of the rest of us could in summarising everything and giving us the fire and the enthusiasm for the next steps. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this afternoon. It's been another terrific discussion with loads of material for us to take away and think about, including lots of material about the invisibility of alternative structures, the need to raise awareness among cooperators, trade unionists, the general public, everybody, in fact. Lots of interesting material about the lack of infrastructure, the overlaps between activism in the community and trade unions and among cooperators. And I think the two things that I take away from today really is about the importance of political education for everybody. And you know, if we want decent work, if we want workplace democracy, if we want economic democracy, then a necessary first step is political education and ongoing political education. And then, which leads on to the second point, it's only when you do that then that people feel that they really can be empowered to make a change. So education first, to give you the tools to be empowered in the workplace. I really am looking forward to, as Freddie has said, I'm looking forward to all the debates that we're going to be having in Wortley Hall on the 20th and 21st of May. It's going to be terrific to actually see everybody in the flesh. It's been a great 3 months of online seminars. I've enjoyed them thoroughly. I feel like I've learned something every 5 minutes. Thank you to all our contributors over the last few months, and thank you too to the audience. I've been recognizing names again and again, and I really do appreciate the time and the commitment you've made to thinking and talking about union co-ops. It gives me hope for what's going to come next. So listen, thank you all very much, everybody. Have a good evening. I notice it's just started raining outside. So Sarah, I'm joining you in the bad weather. And hopefully see you all in May in Wortley Hall. Good evening, everybody. And thank you all very much for attending.